to help us follow along, that would be great.
Okay. Can you see?
Let me move my screen on. Yep, that looks great.
Yep.
Just move some things out of the way. Okay. Perfect. Okay, let me just bring up my notes. Good. Okay, go right ahead.
Alrighty.
Actually, James, are you recording?
Of course.
Okay.
Good to go?
Sounds like it. Yep, good to go.
Alrighty. I'm a district administrator, so as I go into classrooms, what I see a lot, sometimes I think a little too much of is like the use of gamification and you know, other software teaching for entire periods of class of, you know, the class time. So I was interested in researching what literature says and you know, the degree to which using it becomes too much and it has a negative impact on student learning. So I have access as a district RTI coordinator. I have access to a lot of data, student performance data, and you know, see a lot of how teachers are using the technologies in the classroom. So I'm just going to share kind of what I was thinking, the direction I was thinking of heading for this project. What I would like to know is how has the use of gamification changed assessment and instruction in elementary classrooms today? I would like to use the 5 elementary buildings, so my focus would be K-5 and my current district, and just collecting data regarding the frequency that they're using gaming software during the different components of the lesson throughout the day, and you know, seeing how which classrooms tend to perform better or not based on their utilization of gamification. So some of the questions I hope to answer are how has the use of gamification affected student learning historically in the district, and you know, in general, how has implementing educational software as part of the curriculum impacted districts fiscally, and has it been in a positive way? What does literature suggest about, you know, the most beneficial ways to use gamification to enhance student learning? Where it's more prevalent in buildings, in the 5 elementary buildings, was it that students perform better when it was used more frequently? And which content areas did, you know, classrooms tend to use it throughout the day? I was thinking too of, you know, having a possible designing a virtual museum that ties to a grade level curriculum, and inserting aspects of gamification into that, but I wasn't sure how that would turn out. And so I was thinking of my methodology being the formative research approach. I don't think I'll be using, you know, conducting interviews or, you know, using, you know, students. I think the data that I can collect will be, you know, anonymous, and anyone wouldn't be, you know, identified at all with that data. So I was just wondering if this is the right direction, or, you know, any feedback, or should I do something completely different?
Okay. Russ, you mind if I
No,
lead on this one?
go right ahead.
All right. So I find this interesting, but I got some key questions for you.
Okay.
The first of which is, what's your definition of gamification? Because if you ask about 3 different game researchers what gamification is, you're probably going to get 3 different answers.
Okay.
Gamification can mean everything from incentivizing in advertising to the use of off-the-shelf video games inside the classrooms to soldier training. So if you just say gamification, I don't think it is. While it is a buzzword and people have a general idea of what it means, it's not as there isn't a universally accepted definition to just throw it in there and without further clarification in your paper.
Okay.
So, and I mean that's going to lead into some of my other questions.
Okay.
What you said about gamification software being used by these instructors. What's your definition of that software? Are they using off-the-shelf video games? Are they using games that are meant to be educational? Where do you draw the line? For example, there's been a lot of researchers who have used video games like Civilization to help in a history class.
Right.
Is that gamification software? Most people, a lot of researchers would say no, because that's just a game that happened to have incidental learning in it.
Right.
So there's a lot of money, swampy area here that you're, unfortunately, if you do your thesis on this, you're going to have to spend a good portion in your introduction and first few pages just building your platform, what you are looking at and what you're interested in.
Okay. I would say now it's not, it's not the video game lens. It's more like the iReady, the Dreambox, and like that are usually designed by big educational organizations.
Right. So, I mean, that's not a problem. It's just you have to be very clear about that.
Okay.
So you need to be extremely explicit with, when I say gamification, I mean these things and not these other things.
Okay. All right.
You also, I think there's a, because of people playing loose with the term gamification, a lot of people have negative views of gamification, whether gamification is exploitative or not. So, and there's also this idea of like, because of certain edutainment software like ABC Mouse or something, where hey, what's 2 + 2? If you answer correctly, you get to shoot an arrow at the board. Like you get to play a little bit of this game. That is usually viewed very negatively by the game studies researchers, because the actual learning is not tied to the mechanics of the gamification. The gamification, it's like the game's just the candy for taking, like, it's the whole carrot and stick. Like if you take the medicine, then you get the candy type of approach, which is a very poor model for gamification, I feel. That a lot of researchers would say that if to do gamification correctly, you need to have a systemness approach to the game. By playing the game and getting better at the game, the students are actually improving their understanding and skills within the subject matter. Does that make sense? So, and when you take a look at, like, I mean, a lot of those, the very old gamification or edutainment title of Carmen Sandiego, by being a better detective, you learned more about geometry and thus achieved the goal of learning geography. Sorry. It's getting late.
Yeah, no worries.
But you understand what I'm saying here.
Right.
So you need to so
I chose, like, so I would have to be particular about the type of software I'm studying, like that teachers are using. So if I do use, because I do know some classrooms do use like ABC Mouse and Starfall and things like that.
Right.
But it seems like, from what you're saying, that if games like that, if they answer a letter correctly, then they get to go into this house or they get to get prizes. It's not a good example of
I mean, it's not necessarily completely devoid of benefit. It's but you need to be, you know, I've been to conferences where they talk about like, oh, like this is not a good example of gamification, but then this is like a lot of people would refer to Dragon Box Learning as a good example of math gamification, because by playing the game you actually learn the principles of algebra versus something that's, you know, essentially flashcards, right? So the, and I think, and a clarification of that, and a maybe your entire thesis could be coming with some sort of matrix of explaining, you know, a different, or maybe build like a scale of different levels of gamification, um and actually showing their benefits. I mean, kind of stratifying that for the layperson might be what you can do as your project.
Okay.
As for using the data that you have access to,
Mm-hmm.
even if it's or if you're, I, I hesitant. I'm
Mm-hmm.
again probably going to be repeating Russ here. Hesitant for you collecting data, because even if you have it anonymously, you still need IRB approval.
Okay. So
Um,
if I kind of classified the type of software programs and just the impact, like could I be more general, like in these classrooms it showed, in better performance versus specific data?
yes, I mean that wouldn't need IRB approval, but if you're going to like do anything where you collect data from human individuals, that needs IRB approval. But if you have existing data from a classroom over which piece of software is they found more effective or not, that wouldn't.
Okay.
Does that make sense?
Yeah.
IRB basically deals with human subjects. If you're collecting information from human subjects, that's what needs approval. If you're collecting generalized thing about software, that wouldn't. Does that make sense?
So when you say generalized things about software,
Yeah, like if you're taking, Russ, do you want to take a stab at this?
Well, I would avoid it. I mean, I don't think you're going to need it. I think in general, what you're going to need is if you could just get information that's already published. This is basically your lit review, and sort of do a meta-analysis of that. Like, what is it showing that's best for certain types of classes? Where does it work? Where doesn't it work? I don't think you want to do any sort of data collection.
okay.
Basically, if you're doing your own data collection uh, from sources, that's what needs IRB approval.
Okay.
Well, if you're, yeah, as long as it shows that it was collected legally, like it's already published data or it's data that went through a review process, I think you're going to be okay. But you may, but
Yeah,
just
that isn't the type of data I have. It isn't published data. But that's okay. I mean, if I compare in the sense, like you said, like with the literature review, and just look at studies from the of schools and how they performed with the different types of software and develop that scale.
sure.
I could do that as well.
I
Yeah.
mean, if it's generalized, I mean, if you might be able to, if it's generalized data about the effectiveness of that if you're collecting this data from the teachers not from the students themselves, you might be able to get expedited IRB review, and just basically the IRB just goes, "Yep, you're fine." But like once you start collecting information from minors, that's automatically goes into a more detailed review.
Okay.
Yeah, I mean, I think part of what I would see as your analysis relates, number one, to what do you mean by gamification? Like, not just what games were used, but how did they use them? So if you did sort of an analysis of that, maybe 5 different approaches to how to use games in the classroom, maybe looking at the different age groups and the different classes like math versus history versus to sort of delegate it that way or categorize it. So to create sort of a chart as to the different methods that are being used and how they're being used. And then I think you might still require approvals, but you could look at overall grades in those classes versus others that don't use that approach or don't use classes. So you're not dealing with individuals, you're just dealing with
Oh, that'd be good.
grades. Yeah, so you could, which is what you'd want anyway. I mean, individuals really aren't what you're interested in. I think you're more interested in, is this working or isn't it?
Have you seen this Gabe Zitterman's TED Talk?
No.
He talks about gamification, and his TED Talk basically talks about how like we had all these great educational titles that everyone knew about back in the 90s, and what's the difference between them and what's available now. And so he's a gamification researcher. You might want to take a look at some of his papers in addition to his TED Talk. I put his name there so you can Google it and take a look at his stuff.
Where's his name?
In the chat. So if you click the chat bar or on Zoom.
I don't know if I'm.
You might.
Oh, I see.
Gabe Zitterman. It's right there. You might want to take a look at James. Did you take my gamification class?
No, I don't recall seeing it like when I
I
enrolled.
probably last few years I've been teaching it in the summer, and
Oh, then no.
Yeah. So the textbook we used in that class is written by a researcher named James Paul Gee. James Paul Gee started his scientist career. He was already famous as a instructional linguist researcher before he ever touched with games. But he wrote a book on what games have to teach us about learning and literacy that I use as the textbook for my gamification class. Him and all in his department at the University of Wisconsin-Madison basically take a look at this whole idea of using games for learning. He had, I think Squire is one of his students that he's wrote a number of papers about using like Civilization for education, using the game Civilization for education and teaching history. And you could even take, they have, I think, was it the series? Games, Learning, and Society? No. I can't. They have a conference that they host over at the Wisconsin-Madison about this subject matter that you might be able to find some papers and some other research. So for your literature review.
Okay, what is that called again?
The conference, or I'm trying to think.
Okay.
But I mean, let me see.
If I went into the library, the university library, and typed in his name, would I get works? Or
Yeah, I'll try. I'll go ahead and um. All right, so this is the name of, and if you Google, sorry, let me get up, zoom back up here.
Okay.
There's the name of James Paul Gee. If you look him up, he or as everyone calls him, Jim Gee, because he likes to go by Jim. Actually met him once. And reference what do what do video games have to teach us about learning and literacy? That you can use that as like the basis of evaluating these different gamifications tools.
Okay. All right.
Could I just ask, you reference curriculum maps. What do you mean by that?
Well, so I was going to take like, I don't know, a grade 1 unit of study, and like for maybe science or social studies, and then show and create like a virtual museum with like a mock-up with the type of gamification, with like the students were to go into there and they're learning about a certain lesson. And that's how I was trying to kind of tie into more project into it, but I don't know if that's going to work out.
Oh, I see. So that would have been your museum that you've been referring to. I gotcha. So yeah, that might be, yeah. So, and the museum is sort of this place where students could pick and choose amongst the tools that are out there, the software.
Right.
Uh-huh. Well, yeah, I would actually be a little easier probably, but in the sense that you don't have to reach conclusions, you're just seeing the product, and it would be sort of more of a visual thing of how that's laid out. But I can see what you're doing, I think, in terms of where you want to go with sort of connecting games with outcomes.
Yes.
Yeah, I added a couple more authors that you might want to see. Kurt Squire, I think, was one of James Paul Gee's students. He's done wrote a number of books on games and learning. And Yasmin Kafai is also another researcher who's very famous in this field.
Alrighty.
So, I mean, definitely, I think your project should focus on almost defining gamification and then presenting some of the data you have on its effectiveness that you've seen. Does that make sense?
Yep.
All right.
Have you? I noticed you listed Dr. Stam. Was there? What was your reasoning on that, or what were you thinking, or are you?
I've worked with her on with papers, and I've had classes with her, so I thought that she would be a good advisor or first read. But then she recommended. I'm sorry, I don't know how to say your name.
Dr. Usel.
Dr. Usel, and I'm fine with it. I think it was a great idea, especially listening to all the feedback right now. So I think it's great.
Yeah, she might be a good second reader, particularly since you know her. So that might be sort of after you've gotten feedback from Dr. Usel, you could sort of run that by her, because she'd be somewhat new to it.
Yeah, he said she would do the second read, so sounds like a plan.
Yeah, it does. Yeah, so a lot of your focus might be on what is this thing we call gamification, and what does it mean in the setting that you're at? How has it been done? It's more of an analysis of a use of games in the learning environment and how that's played itself out, and what you're seeing, and maybe you can spot some trends. Maybe you can find some activities, and then you could, I mean, it would be nice in a perfect world if you had some classes that used it and the same class that taught the same subject but didn't use any games at all, and you could sort of get a sense of that. But that's, that's a difficult one because, controlling for all sorts of outside factors like the teacher who teaches it, I don't know, the demographics of the students in one class versus another, whether it's during the day or at night. There's so many other factors that it's a little hard to control for just the fact that one used a game and one isn't. So you may want to just focus on that it's being used in certain classes and what's happening in those classes. How are they implementing this concept we call gamification?
Mm-hmm.
And could possibly look at overall. Yeah, you could possibly look at overall grades. It's just that, the grades thing, I think, is a tricky one. It's hard to do that after the fact because you're really, unless you can control for things.
Yeah, the whole idea behind IRB is to protect the participants of a study, so we don't have a repeat of some of the less ethical studies that have happened in science's past. So sharing student grades if someone can trace that back to a student that they got a bad grade because of some reason or another, that's what an IRB board would be concerned with. So, again, you said it would all be anonymous, but they get really touchy when it comes to that sort of data.
But if I would use more comprehensive, the total building, 32% were proficient versus.
That's better. Yeah. It's that. I think that should probably be expedited, but we always try to encourage students to go with previously published data whenever possible, because you don't need an IRB because that assumingly have already been blessed, as it were.
All right. So then I'll take that route then. It sounds like the more wisest or the wiser.
Fastest. Let's just put it that way.
Oh, okay.
Back at Penn State, pretty much it was no matter what, you always had to get IRB approval just to make sure that you didn't need IRB approval. It was kind of crazy, but
All right.
Well, I like your overall theory. The use of games in non-game contexts with the intention of making learning more engaging. So all you're going to do is explain what's going on. You're not going to reach any conclusions about that. That would really involve a lot more research and really a lot more work than I think we've even sort of trained you in, and that you've been trained in. So it could be tricky. But I just doing the analysis, what's going on today, it's sort of a point in time, more of a case study of what's going on in your district with games. I think that could be really useful, and maybe a couple tables listing all the games, listing all the outcomes for those games. How are they using it? Sort of it's capturing a moment.
All right. Sounds good.
Well, I think you're okay. I think this is good, and also it's more focused. To reach conclusions about games based on a very tiny subset of whatever 5 classes and 5 different subject areas and on a particular semester in history is really tough to do. But I think if all it is capturing what's going on right now, you can do that very well, and you're not trying to tell people what to do or to reach any major conclusions at this time. Does that sound good, Dr. Usel?
Yep, sounds great. I think we kind of overstepped. I know we kind of started late, but I think we can probably start wrapping it up now. What do you think?
Yeah, I mean, do any other students have any questions or thoughts on this? You want to add anything? Otherwise, well, give it a minute here. You may want to also look, trying to think, but look over the thesis projects done over the years and see which ones have been done about gamification, and that might help. Let's see. um, Yeah, there's gamification of learning and instruction. Okay. Yeah, so I don't see anything right off the bat for Dr. Usel may be more aware of this, but if you look at other courses, let me do it. Quick share. I'm going to take this away from you for just a moment. And here's, let's see, actually, oh, there it is. Okay. So yeah, I just typed in gamification, and you'll see that there's quite a bit already there. And I think if nothing else, you may want to get a sense of what's meant about gamification based on what's already been published out there.
Okay.
So you may want to look at those, because I think you were talking about keeping the user interested and motivated. That might be something you want to focus on. It looked like when you brought up that text you had, that a lot of that had to do with motivation, and a lot of the issues around gamification is that it's keeping users engaged, interested, and motivated. So you want to look at that. Okay, I'm ready to call it a night.
It's been a long day.
Yeah, it's tough. But I really appreciate your being able to make it out. Zipporah, I know we sort of had to